Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Pat Kowitzel. I'm the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books. And we're really excited to have all of you with us tonight, watching from hopefully from the comfort of your home or with some loved ones. It feels like we've been doing this for a very long time. It's just been since April that we've been doing these virtual events, but we have been doing 2, 3, even 4 a week. This is a week where we actually have 4 of our virtual events, and so we have something just about every night, and we really are excited about the book and the author that we're celebrating tonight, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But first, I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that we had a big kind of list of upcoming events, with more being added all the time. Those events can be found on the magiccitybooks.com website. We'll be posting that link in our chat tonight. We'll also be posting links to purchase Toni's book, Carrie, and so that link will be in the chat as well. If you have not already purchased a copy, we encourage you to certainly do so. Toni was generous enough to come over and sign copies of her book at the store over this last weekend, and so if you buy the book from Magic City Books, you'll be able to get a signed copy. So take a look at that. You also maybe have seen in the last couple of days, if you follow us on social media or get our newsletter, that we have a big event coming up in October with the Academy Award-winning actor Matthew McConaughey. And so we're really excited about that one. It should be a really interesting conversation. He's journaled and written diaries for 4 decades and has kind of grouped all of that together with some editing help, I'm sure, in a book. And so we'll have a really interesting conversation in October. That is one of the few ticketed events that we're doing this fall. And so it comes with a copy of the book. We're also doing a ticketed event next Wednesday night with the author Michael Denzel Smith. His new book is called Stakes is High, and it is about life in Trump's America. It's powerful, it's personal, and we just heard today that it is a finalist for the Kirkus Prize in nonfiction. So it's going to be a book that people are reading and talking about a lot, and we're really lucky to be able to bring him for a virtual event 1 week from tonight, one day after the book came out. So all of that information is at magiccitybooks.com, and we would love for you to join us there. Tonight, we are really thrilled to be welcoming Toni Jensen, and we're going to be talking about her new book, Carrie, a memoir, also a very, certainly a very personal story about guns and her life as a Native American, and kind of the way that guns incorporate into her life as a child, but also as an adult, and many, many, many other subjects. We're really thrilled tonight to be joined by, to have Toni joining conversation by Brandon Hobson. Brandon is the National Book Award finalist for Where the Dead Sit Talking, and has a new book that we're really excited about that's coming out in February, I believe, of next year, and called The Removed. And so we're going to have links to pre-order that book as well. But Brandon and Toni know each other from IAIA, and I think some other connections that are back in there. And we're just so thrilled to be welcoming Brandon Hobson to lead our conversation, and Toni Jensen in a celebration of this outstanding book. Brandon, Toni, take it away.
Thank you. So, hi, Toni. And Toni and I teach together in the low-res MFA program in Santa Fe, and it's really been great. I haven't probably told you this, but it's really been great to teach alongside you and to listen to you read, and so I really appreciate your generosity and your knowledge and just everything. So it's been a real honor, Toni. And I read, so Toni sent me Carrie, and I read it and loved it, of course. And I had heard Toni read parts of it at in Santa Fe. And so for those people who maybe don't know a little bit about the book, can you talk just a little bit about sort of why you decided to write this, and what was your sort of reasoning or inspiration behind? I know because, you know, there's a lot in this book that's covered. I mean, not just in terms of your native identity, but also, you know, the idea of a gun culture, right, that we continue to live in, and that you've experienced in many different ways. Can you give a little bit of background on why you wanted to write the book?
Sure. It is a memoir, but it's a memoir in essays. And those first essays started back in 2016. I was doing some research for what I thought might be a novel about gun culture, and particularly about fracking and indigenous women's lives being at risk along fracking sites, man camps, that sort of thing. So I was doing a lot of traveling because I had a little research leave, and I was going all across America. And I had some incidents of violence happen to me. At the same time, there were some incidents of violence that happened to friends, former students, family members, and it was all just sort of coalescing. And then, of course, Trump and the election. And I think everyone felt like we were living in a different country. And so Carrie isn't necessarily my reaction to living in Trump's America, because everything in the book predates this administration in a way. Many of the stories predate this administration. And I think Native people, we've been living in a version of this world probably since always, right? But yeah, 2016 is when I started writing the first essays. And eventually I realized I had probably a book, and that if I looked back through my life, I could definitely weave together stories with gun violence and gun culture as the thread. And so, yeah, so that's really where it started, was just a few discrete incidents that got me really thinking about my life and how gun violence has really been one of the major narrative threads.
Yeah, I do want to encourage other people, if you have questions throughout, please feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll get to them. But along those lines of the violence, gun violence, which has been around for, you know, a long time now, and specifically one of the pieces that I've heard you read aloud, where you talked about feeling threatened in graduate school as you were working on your PhD, feeling sort of threatened. There's also this idea of masculinity that feels very important to the book. Was that something also that you were thinking about in terms of, I mean, it feels like, yeah, since 2016, we live in a very masculine country, right? There's this idea of, you know, masculinity that feels in some ways dangerous, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? Or
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, I think there have been a couple interviews I've done and a couple other just conversations about the book I've done where the person asking that question has not been a woman, let's say, and has asked that question in a different sort of way than you're asking it. So I appreciate the way you're asking it. I want to say that first. Oh yeah, there is the chapter on the one workshop situation in grad school, and it wasn't a discrete situation either. I wove together events from several workshops. Boy, it got better at Texas Tech, where I did my PhD. As time went on, people arrived, as I say in that essay, and I refer to them as my company. So my company arrived, right, and things got a lot better. But there was a lot of just the clear notion that, yeah, we were, the women in the class and the minorities in the class were supposed to be quiet. And it didn't come from the professors, not at all, but rather it came from just a handful of men in the classroom. And a couple of them got more and more insistent that you know, their way was going to be the way, and it didn't go over very well for them in the end. But yeah, I think from the classroom to outside the classroom, there's another chapter in the book where I talk a lot about the statistics of who commits gun violence. And I was surprised to learn, I wasn't surprised to learn that it's predominantly men, but I was surprised at the statistics that it was, you know, in every category of violence, 80% or higher of the crimes, gun violence crimes were committed, and violent crimes are committed by men. And that did surprise me, that the statistics were that high in every single category. And so learning that, then you can't unlearn it. And the way that we speak about gun violence, how we don't gender it, how we want to say the perpetrator, right? The gunman or the killer or the shooter. The shooter is very popular, just to say the shooter. And that's, why are we making it gender neutral if we know the gender? What linguistic or sociopolitical purpose is served by that, right? And so these were some of the ways in which I couldn't, once I knew those things, I couldn't unknow them. And so then I felt like I had to have that be a point of emphasis in the book.
Was there a specific, I guess, you know, if for me to write one essay on gun, because I know so little about them, you know.
Sure.
I mean, even being from Oklahoma, right? I mean, that's, you know, no interest in hunting or you know, owning a gun or anything, and just not interested in it. Yet so many people are. I know that to write an essay, certainly a number of essays, you know, dealing with these, would take me a long time because of all the research I would have to do. What was your research process like? I know because every piece is, you know, different, but can you talk a little bit about what you had to research and then what you relied on in terms of just, you know, memory?
Yeah, I mean, my mom's already told me I got one thing wrong as far as memory. I was pleased that it was only one small thing. The amount of days she came to Pittsburgh when my daughter was born, I am off. So I promised her we would look at correcting that for the paperback. But other than that, for my mom to not think I had messed up the memories was really pretty amazing, honestly. She read the book last week. I do feel like I was relying only on memory, and I'm very clear in the book that I'm relying on memory for my memories, that I didn't do a lot of asking around in my family, because a lot of what I'm dredging up there is painful and is going to be painful for them to read. And so I wasn't going to dredge it up 3 or 4 or 5 times in most cases, right? And ask them repeatedly to go over a thing with me. So my memories are my own for the narrative parts, but for the researched parts, I really had a very good time researching the history of all the places I'd lived. Because when you live there, you hear things and maybe you don't, especially when I was younger. When I lived in Kingman, Arizona, for example, I'd heard about the military history there, and I'd heard about the history of the native people who live there, but I hadn't traced it so precisely. So it was really very interesting to learn about some of those histories. And in some cases, not Kingman in particular, but in other cases, it was really fun and interesting to learn more about Fayetteville, for example, Arkansas, where I live now. I talk about it in the Osage orange trees here, and I didn't know that much about them, even though I have one in my yard. You know, I didn't know that much. So learning about the flora and the fauna, learning about the history, some of that was very sad and terrible, some of the older history, but a lot of it was really very interesting. So, and mostly I read books. I read a lot of books about all of the places, and I did a lot of Googling, and I got interested, of course, in the origins of words too, and did a lot of research on that, and that was really fun. I enjoyed that part of the research.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word fun, and I mean, I know that when I'm teaching writing, that's an important word, right? Is usually you say the word research, and you know, people's eyes roll back of their heads, right? You know, because it's such a terrible, you know, especially when you're talking about students, you know, just starting out to write, you know, serious essays, and but and maybe in your fiction too, one of the fun things about fiction writing for me is doing research, right? Which, you know, I feel like other than just, doing a lot of Googling or whatever, but actually, you know, talking to people and finding out sort of specific stories. I haven't really written too much nonfiction, and the little nonfiction that I have written has actually been fiction because I tend to embellish things, you know, and fictionalize them. So, you know, I can't speak to the nature of fun in writing an entirely piece of, you know, memoir, for example. But for you, what specifically, I mean, you mentioned the research, but for the writing process in general, was there anything specifically that you found fun? Or was it more difficult?
I think it was always fun to finish a chapter, of course, right? Everyone likes to have the little victory of having a thing done. For me, the stories are pretty heavy, a lot of them, but the fun came from figuring out which Webster's words were going to take prominence and which ones were. I mean, I would usually have 4 or 5 possibilities and then winnow it down. There's a Camptosaurus, which is a dinosaur in one. There's Candy, my sister and I fighting over Candy in another. So there was one that had more love songs in it that got cut, but I had up on my wall for a while on just a piece of, you know, printed out paper, more love songs, more Candy, because I think the book really, because it's so heavy, there's heavy content, it needed the balance of like a Camptosaurus, a dinosaur, the Candy, the love songs, those sorts of things. And so that ended up being fun. My dogs throughout like the history of my life really are all in the book, and they were very silly and rambunctious and had all these antics. So it was fun remembering their different escapades and including those in the book, and thinking about all the different places I've lived, the scenery. I've lived a lot of really violent places, which comes up, I think, clearly in Carrie, but I lived a lot of beautiful places too. And so that was really fun, remembering.
Yeah, I could see that. Your style is so, you know, you have a very distinct style, it feels like to me, especially in this book. And your sentences don't feel labored over. They feel very natural. And I feel like there's some sort of, when I'm reading your work, and partly, you know, I feel like I can hear your voice. I've heard you read from it, and you know, but there's that. When you talk about writing, especially memoir, because I know a lot of people are really interested in writing about their lives. Do you often recommend that people focus on that sort of natural voice of their own, or do you approach it the act of writing the memoir a different way? I guess the other question is, you know, if someone were to ask you for advice, I'm interested in writing about this aspect of my life or about my life in general, to broaden that out a little bit, what sort of things would you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, stylistically, I think each person is going to go about it differently. And I think each book, each piece, each individual essay, or even sometimes each section of an essay will demand something different. So I always try, when someone says, oh, I want to write this thing, but I don't know how to go about it, I always try to advise them just to do it, just to try it. Try writing for all of my students. If any of them are listening, will be rolling their eyes because I say this so often. You probably even heard me say it at IAIA, but it's not fancy. I set the microwave timer for 45 minutes and I write for 45 minutes and I take a 15-minute break. That is how, you know, 50, 60, 70% of my writing gets done. So I tell them to do that. And whatever comes out then comes out fast, because you're not allowed to do other things. You can drink some coffee or some water or whatever, but that's about it. Those 45 minutes you're just dedicated to this thing you keep saying you want to write but aren't actually writing. So then once you have that, you kind of know, I think, from fast writing what the style is meant to be, and then you hone it and you make it, you know, whether you want it to be highly stylized, for example, or you want it to feel more natural, right? And it's the same, I think, as in fiction. Really, it's not that different. You take on a voice almost. Yes, it's more yours because it's nonfiction, so probably it does sound more like you, but some pieces are going to be more stylized. Some are going to be more in other people's voices because they're more heavily researched. Yeah, I do, as you all can hear, probably listening to me talk, I do talk in long sentences, and the book has that kind of a cadence and a rhythm, and so that does come pretty naturally. So if there's art to that, then it's in going back and making sure there's also some balance to that, so that there's long sentence followed by short, so it's not a runaway train sort of narration entirely, so that someone's driving the train, right, and it stays on the tracks. Yeah.
Is there someone specifically that inspires your nonfiction?
There is a book called Proxies by a writer named Brian Blanchfield, who's primarily a poet. And I got Brian's book in 2016 as I first started writing essays. And his essays in that book, I think he was a finalist for the National Book Award for it. They were all short and precise. And he was doing interesting things with the lyric and with language. And yet he was also telling the story of his life. And it was place-based. I really thought that book, probably more than any other, expanded my notion of what nonfiction could do or could be, and still get a readership in the world, you know? And so that also, Therese Maya, her book, Heartberries, the way every sentence is so neat and precise was really inspiring to me. So I think I look to maybe things outside nonfiction for inspiration and content, but for language, the two of them, I think you're not going to do really a whole lot better.
Yeah, I was thinking of, I've read a lot of Joan Didion's work, starting with her fiction, but also, the White Album and some of her nonfiction, which is very inspiring for me. I mean, I don't know if you work like that. Like, I get that question asked a lot is, first there's the question of when you feel blocked, right? And you sit down, and because we can always say, okay, I'm going to sit down because I have an hour here and I'm going to sit down and write. But then, and students will say this, right? They'll say, yeah, but I'll sit down and I'll write like a paragraph, and then that just feels like it's it. What's the, sort of solution to that? I always feel like, I don't know if you're like this, but I always feel like, picking up somebody whose work I love, and reading it. And because part of that is getting the language going in your head, and that, the flow of language and the rhythm of the sentences, and that there's something so inspiring about that helps me anytime and so I don't know if are you like that also? You feel like picking up?
No, absolutely. I know I picked up, well, Brian and Therese's books, also they both have that advantage. Back when we could go places, right? And we were on airplanes and I was traveling in 2016 through 2019. They're small. And so are little books of poetry. And so I pack incredibly lightly when I go on an airplane trip. I have one little carry-on bag and it goes under the seat in front of me even. And so, yes, I love poetry, and yes, I love discreet, beautiful little books of nonfiction, but also those books literally traveled with me all over the country. And that was part of it. I'd be on a trip and I would pick one up. Jamal May, both his books of poetry, I read over and over and over. Joy Hardrow's, the one here, that's right here, let's see, A Map to the Next World. I read that over and over. So there were just maybe 5 or 6 books that I took with me when I would go traveling, or I would pull off the shelf if I was stuck. I also do a trick that I've read about somewhere, some writing textbook, to take, open up a cookbook, and you have to pick something from either the description of how to make the thing or the recipe itself, and take like 5 words from the cookbook, and they have to be in whatever you write. And I just find that to be so weird and fun. That always works for me too. So if not poetry, then a cookbook, but I never go to prose, hardly ever, unless it's really poetic prose for that, I guess. Because then I might fall in. If I read Louise Erdrich, for example, then I'm trying to write like Louise Erdrich, because that style gets in, or Stephen Graham Jones, his voice will get in there. And, no one wants a bad imitation of Louise Erdrich or Stephen Graham Jones, right? So but the poets, it doesn't work that way. It's just good. Yeah.
Because there's something also about, the image, the idea of, it's beyond the language, but it also has to do with the imagery, that something sparks in the brain when reading, specifically poetry, for me, that, and it might be maybe even surreal imagery. I don't know, because I mean, I tend to read, I'll read, something like Charles Simic, often just for the image alone. And so your book, though, Carrie, it's so heavy, as you mentioned. Do you feel like, I guess, when writing it, dealing with these themes, these such heavy themes, did you ever feel afraid to go forward? This is a long way of me asking you how afraid you were, or at all, right? I mean, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of stuttering on this, but
Yeah.
I guess the question that I'm thinking about has to do with the idea of, okay, especially with memoir, right? Should I confront this on the page, and should I write about this, or should I step back and, because this is not therapeutic writing that I'm, this is not journaling. This is, something else, right? I mean, it's writing to a readership. And so you're, exposing yourself from certain situations. And how does fear play a role in that?
That's a really good question. And I've been asked a slightly different variation of this question several times. I think people assume maybe that I had a hard time revealing the difficult things that have happened to me in particular, or from my past. For whatever reason, I guess those weren't as difficult for me to write about as writing about the things that happen to other people. And I've noticed reading the essays aloud at II or in other venues, or recently reading the audiobook, I only got choked up and had to sort of pause and really collect myself when reading about other people being put at risk. So I think maybe that means I'm just old enough now and I've done enough work putting distance and figuring out like how I really feel about all of the things that have happened to me, that I'm okay with writing about those. And I'm okay with taking questions about those. The decisions of writing about family members and things that have happened to them were the hardest. What to include. I mean, there are things that are not in the book, of course, and what to exclude and why. Whose lines would I be crossing? Would I be violating anyone's privacy? Would I be telling stories they'd rather not be told? And in some cases, I'm sure I'm telling stories that people would rather I didn't tell. But also, I feel like none of us have been served. I mean, my family, in my cultures in this country, by keeping silent about certain sorts of violence, especially domestic violence. We talk about it so rarely and we fictionalize it. And I think fiction's tremendously important and serves a role there, but there isn't any reason we can't talk about it if it's our own personal stories too. There just isn't. And I think seeing someone come out the other side of it and being able to talk about it and write about it can be powerful. And to put it in a context that it's so common. It doesn't, why does it have to be this thing we never talk about when it is so common? It is very everyday. It's in every community, on every street. So then why is it something that's taboo to talk about if it's so commonplace?
Yeah, especially right now. This book feels so timely right now, and do you hope to inspire anyone specifically with this book, or is there a specific,
Yeah, I mean, I think there are maybe 2 or 3 kinds of people that I think this book might be hard to read, but also good to read. Maybe people who grew up in similar circumstances, and mostly, I mean, I meet a lot of other people in university settings or at conferences or in sort of professional life settings, and I always think of them as being very attached to like the jacket with the elbow patches, right? Like they're fronting so hard because they want to belong, and so then nothing bad ever happened to them in the past, right? They never experienced any hunger or poverty or violence, and they just arrived fully formed with like tweed elbow patches somehow. And so this is in part for them to say, you can put some of that down. You know, you can have a professional level life and job and career, and not have to front so hard that your growing up was otherwise, right? I understand that that's like a mechanism of trying to fit in or whatever, but like, who is that serving also? So there's that set. There's also just, I think, the people who are struggling, girls in particular, young women, who find themselves in difficult relationships, whether familial or husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, wife. Yeah, and that, you know, you can get out of a thing and come out the other side of it, and you can write about it, and it is worthwhile subject matter. I so often, and you maybe find this too, have to convince the women in my classes, that even the graduate students, that their stories are worth telling. That they don't have to, they can certainly fictionalize and tell any stories they want, but if they want to tell their stories, they're worth telling. So I think those would be, and then also Native people who grow up far from culture, right? Who aren't necessarily wanting to write so much about identity, or to write from a place of being deeply embedded in culture. That's a story too. Families that try very hard toward whiteness, that's a story. It's not a culture embracing story, unfortunately, but I do think it's a story worth telling. I think it's part of the very American narrative of trying to belong and fit in.
Absolutely. I think you're right. To return to this idea, you mentioned the women, and I think it's certainly true of women and guys as well, right?
Yeah.
Men as well, in terms of, I think, you know, it's been my experience, so many people feel like their stories aren't important, you know, and so it's just sort of, yes, right? This is, you know, tell me this one aspect of your life. And they tend to sort of shy away and say, oh, you know, it's, you know, that happens to a lot of people, right? Doesn't sort of diminish its importance to be told, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking about, you know, especially domestic violence, right? It is very, unfortunately, very common. That doesn't mean it's not an important story to tell.
Yeah.
And so,
and it's in the execution of it. It's in how you tell the story. This notion that any story, I remember the first short story that I wrote that won a prize of any sort was from my first collection at the Powell Hotel. And Fran Ringgold, who ran the Nimrod Journal out of Tulsa. And Fran, when she called me up to tell me that I'd won, she said, yeah, you know, I just have a thing. I don't ever, like, it's a cancer story, right? And I don't ever, like, if you're not supposed to write a cancer story, but boy, that was a really good cancer story. And it really, and we both laughed, and she's so funny. But you know, I think there's really, that stuck with me, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. Oh, you're not supposed to write a domestic violence story, or like a car crash story, right? Or like there's this whole, oh my God, not an abortion story. There's this whole list, and it's just stupid. It's in how you go about it. It's not the material itself. So really, just about anything can become interesting. Rick Bass has a book about back when he used to work as a petroleum geologist. I am not interested in petroleum geology. I mean, right, not even a little bit, right? Yeah. That's a really good book. It's actually really very interesting. And so it's in the execution.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I mean, I was just talking, you know, to a student about dreams and how that cliche of, you know, don't incorporate a dream into your work. And then I point to Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams, right, which came out in the early 90s and ended up being an international bestseller, which is about Albert Einstein, you know, and all these different dreams that he had. Like the entire book is full of his dreams and dealing with the, you know, theory of relativity. And I mean, there's always the way to, you know, sort of break the rule. And it's good. I think it's good for people to know those things, right? And to think about. One more question, and then I want to open it up if there are some people who who want to ask questions, please type in the chat. But you know, I'm interested in bird imagery, right? And you are too, right? Can you talk a little bit about birds?
Yeah. I mean, I do think someone asked me a question about this on Facebook today, a new Facebook friend, and he said that in his painting, he was always trying to use certain things because his paintings were really dark as balance, and he wondered if the birds in my book were doing a similar thing. And I think he was absolutely right. Yeah, I think that the birds are both regular and everyday, and we all know pretty much what a robin looks like, right? Or a grackle. Hideous birds, grackles, but or a grackle, or the more majestic hawks or other birds. And so either for beauty or for the regular everyday kind of grounding, I think it's nice for readers who haven't been through some of the things I've been through to come upon a bird, which is a regular thing, and be able to take a breath. Okay, that's just a bird, right? And also they're beautiful. Also, they're original too, in many cases, not all, but in many cases to the land that they live on. And part of what I'm doing in the book is talking about who lived in a place first, right? What tribes lived there first, what tribal people still live on the land, who lives there, who was displaced, who was removed, who came back, you know, and birds have their migratory patterns. So I think they work well in those ways. And I mean, also too, you know, for those of us in universities, there's always a white guy writing a book about birds. Every university has at least one, young to elderly. I mean, the ages, there's a range, but there's always a guy writing a book about birds. And I always thought, well, someday I'll have the leisure, right? I'll have enough leisure and the world will be better. And I won't have to write about like violence and women being put at risk. And I too will have the leisure to write about birds. And that's clearly never going to happen. And so the world is going to remain the world. But yeah, I mean, if Jonathan Franzen can write whole books about birds, the rest of us can at least weave it in and have it as some sort of beauty and balance. So some of that was also kind of purposeful, yes.
Yeah, well, it's done very nicely. Yeah. I want to go to the questions so that everybody has any good time to talk. But the first question is, you deal with such recent current events, including the death of George Floyd and the pandemic. What was it like to process these events in real time?
Yeah, the book was done and we were about to go to final proofs when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And I had a chapter set in St. Paul that dealt with violence and a shooting and also with police. I could not imagine, and my editors, everyone at Ballantine, they were so supportive of me doing this. It was just like a miracle. So over like a 48-hour period, I just wove that in. And then I went back and wove it in other chapters. It just seemed really wrong to me. It seemed like that was a before and after moment. And to have the book come out after, but read like before, I just didn't sit well with me. And I felt like his death was so important and it sparked, so much in this country that it had to be in the book. So I had the time, I just did that over the long weekend, and it was a very long weekend, of coming to terms with everything that was happening. My brother still lives in St. Paul, and, when everything started burning there, I just remember seeing a map and thinking, all the CVS's, for example, and Walgreens were decimated within a certain mile radius. And when I saw that map, I just started to cry because I thought, how are the people who take the bus going to go to the pharmacy? Like the grandmothers, who's going to get them their prescriptions? And it really hit me. And so, yes, George Floyd and his death, absolutely. And what that has sparked all over the country, but also just like the day-to-day of how that affects people who live there, who aren't from Mainz, who have to go to the pharmacy, who have to go to the grocery store, and how those neighborhoods in the Twin Cities were really, they were becoming so powerful and integrated, and you know, a good mix of like outsider businesses and insider local businesses. And to watch that, to watch everything that happened, I mean, it was just really, it's been really difficult, I would say. And so I felt like that was necessary. As far as the coronavirus, I had the second to last chapter. It's called Contagion, and it's about contagion theory in relation to gun violence. And I didn't think there was any way, because that comes from a disease model in our current world, again, not to weave that in and have that be a part of the essay. That would have felt very strange. So I'm just glad that there was just like a weekend's worth of time, you know, to do that.
Yeah. I mean, again, the book feels so timely right now. And even doing this, you know, we've been doing Zoom for months now. And, you know, it's been such a strange and difficult year, I think for everyone, but more reason, I think, that your book should be, you know, these essays should be read. And so, you know, things happen, you know, the timing feels so good with this. So Gail asks, can you talk about your process determining the chapter order?
That's a good question, Gail. Hi, Gail. I bet I know who that is. Yeah, so I think my editor and I, we went over maybe Ilana and I went over 2 or 3 different possible orders. And mostly I've heard a thank for this order. I think it's maybe slightly shifted from the second or third version of it, but there were lots of different ways it could have been ordered. We both really always wanted to start with the Women in the Fracklands essay, because thematically it opens up so much territory. And it goes back to childhood briefly, you know, and I think that it just does a good job of opening up all the things that get covered in the whole book. And then from there, it kind of moves chronologically. The main thread or incident usually is of something that's, you know, in rough chronology of my life. And I've lived a lot of places, so I fully understand it's a lot of moving around, but, you know, I just had to sit down and come up with the timeline of my life, really, since I lived here a year, there a year, you know, back and forth. But mostly it was about a balance of the tensions in the book, the central tensions or threads, and it was about also things like long essays being balanced somewhat with shorter essays, and, you know, just considering the build of the main narrative arc of the book too, alongside those threads of narrative tension that determined the order in the end. And in the end, I was really happy with the order. So,
well, there, you know, I would say it felt very very well done on Ilana's part, right? Helping you determine that order, because that's, yeah, well, you know, I mean, it's like writing fiction, and there are things that, you know, you end up moving around, and like in a story collection, an essay collection, I can sort of see the same way. Yeah, to return to, you know, on a craft level, mm-hmm. right? You know, in terms of just not just the order of the essays, but did you feel like some of the essays were easier on a craft level to write, if that makes sense? Yes. And if so, why?
The one that's set here in Fayetteville, Chicken, that has to do, or it's about Carla Tyson and an incident involving her. That was easy because it was fairly fresh in my mind. It happened just a few years ago, and it just had sort of it opens with me walking from campus back to where we lived at the time, and happening upon like the news crews, right, and the TV cameras and everything. So it had a natural opening. The way that the events moved with her and the things that happened were all kind of chronological and easy. Once I considered the Osage orange trees, that one just felt very natural, and it flowed very easily. The same really with the one set in the Twin Cities, with that thing that happened with my neighbor there. That had a natural flow to it too. Some of them I think are just harder because they deal with more. Pittsburgh was maybe more challenging to weave together the narrative of what had happened to another family as my daughter was being born, with sort of other thematic threads, that one was more challenging. There's a lot of violence in Pittsburgh. And so we lived in a really violent neighborhood, but I went to school in a place where you wouldn't necessarily know you were just a few miles from that sort of violence, right? Like very kind of ivy coated. And so yeah, there was this sense of like two things going on there, and that made that one more challenging.
Good. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking at the net. There, a question just popped up.
Yeah.
So what's next? Do you have your sights set on your next book idea?
I have a couple ideas. One involves a lot of travel, and that's the one I've had now. Since I turned in maybe the first long draft of the book, or maybe even before that, actually, I had a good idea for a book that will be about little pockets of environmental good news and cooperation between unlikely people. Like there's a Cowboy Indian Alliance, that's what they call themselves, in Nebraska, who've been working to sell back land surrounding patchwork reservations and to sell land, some of those patchwork pieces that have gone outside the reservation, to sell it back to tribes, working with the ranchers there, or working for the ranchers and the tribes together to buy other pieces of land next door to reservations to kind of like to stop pipelines in some cases, to work against eminent domain. So those sorts of little pockets of unlikely allyship, right? And so just something where there's some good news, maybe small bits of good news on the environmental front, while we have the wildfires raging and, you know, snow in Colorado and all sorts of clear evidence of climate change and climate crisis. Yeah, I think looking at who's managing to cooperate together and to form some sort of community in certain places. So that's one thing, but that'll require travel. And another one, I have a big birthday coming up in February. And so just thinking about like getting older and what it means to be growing older in this time of climate change, and what it means to be growing older in this time of like staying home where we don't go anywhere and we don't do anything. And so I've been thinking too about narrative, about literally where I live in the past year. And I don't know if that'll be a whole book or just a few essays, but the good news about climate will definitely be a book.
I have started as well, you know, fiction that begins with the scene that I think a big part of it has to do with the climate, right? The climate change, and how that's affecting one specific, you know, much older man in his life. And so that's sort of been a starting point for me on my next project. Wherever that's headed, I'm still in an early draft, but yeah, that these things that, you know, that it was Chekhov that said, right, that, well, at least in terms of fiction, not in terms of nonfiction, but that it begins with questions, right? It should explore, fiction should explore questions. And I think, you know, that's very true, you know, for me. There was another question from Jenny, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. How did you decide in what familial narratives to include and not include? How much input did your family have in writing the memoir, especially around your father, the idea of abuse and alcoholism?
Yeah, no one had any input. I just decided pretty early that I was going to write everything down and then decide from there in a very selective way what to include and not to include. So everything got written, but not everything made it in the book. So it was a process of being very faithful to how I remembered things, and then asking a few questions of a few people, you know, and clarifying. My sister and I had a few conversations, for example, and one of those is included in the book, where we remember a thing differently, and that's included. And that's okay. I think it's good to show that memory is fallible, right? And that even recent conversations sometimes can be remembered very differently by any two people. Yeah, no, my dad has Lewy body dementia, as is, you know, it's one of the threads in the book. So that's not revealing anything that you won't read, you know, at the very beginning even. And so there wasn't any consultation there because, you know, we're not in a place now where there could be any really, but my brother was the only one smart enough early or or prescient enough, maybe is better than smart enough, to sort of say, don't write about me or you have to clear everything with me. And I agreed to that for some reason. And this was years and years ago when I was only writing fiction. So he doesn't even remember it, as it turns out. I could have and he wouldn't have been mad, but I remembered it. And so he's in there, but only peripherally. Also, there really wasn't, I didn't have to cut anything major. There weren't very many things I would have included. But yeah, I just wrote it all down and then I selected from there. But that's a good question. I know other writers do it differently. I remember hearing Alyssa Wishuda one time say her whole family read My Body is a Book of Rules. And I just I couldn't even close my mouth. I mean, I cannot imagine that. No, I think I would not have written it if I had thought they were all going to read it first. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you, and Jim asked this, and I wanted to save it for the end.
Yeah.
But could you read a short passage for us?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
For just a couple of minutes, maybe.
Yeah.
And we a lot of times, we start with the reading, but I kind of like ending with them. After the discussion, something nice to.
Yeah, I think. Let's see. Here, oddly enough, there's a short section in chapter 2 that I think is probably about the right length. I'll read section 3 in chapter 2. Okay. The fall after I turned 4 years old, I wear my first leotard and pale pink shoes to dance class, and then after to the bar to pick up my father. Our class includes 6 boys, 6 girls, and 1 boy, and together we learn to point our toes, to round and elongate our arms, to tuck in our butts when we plie. I have long brown hair that is straight at the top and wavy at the bottom. I'm sturdy and round-faced. I forget often to tuck in what teacher Marianne calls my derriere. The dance class building abuts the bar where my father has a favorite stool, where my father waits in the late afternoon for class to end. Exira, Iowa is a no-stoplight town, holding fewer than 1,000 people, but more than 1 bar. My family lives a few miles down Highway 71, still in Brayton. My mother is working, so my father is assigned the task of fetching and driving me home. To be clear, my father is at this bar most afternoons or early evenings, whether it's dance class day or not. To be clear, at 4 years old, I know already my father is the sort of drinker who brings home either a jovial self or a monster. To be clear, there's no trauma story here in this moment. My father's guns this day remain tucked away at home, way up on the high shelf. The building housing the dance studio sits 2 stories tall with the studio on the 2nd floor tucked around back. The wide, almost square room holds big windows that frame the floor. It holds music, mainly classical. It holds worn linoleum floors and teacher Marianne, who points her own toes with precision, who delivers her directions to us in a steady, strong voice. Teacher Marianne has the same sort of rare power and grace as my grandmother. No one shouts or shoves in a room either of them inhabits. I think of the music Marianne plays in the same way I think of the songs my grandmother sings as we walk the hills around her farm, songs without words. My grandmother mostly hums melodies, but sometimes breaks into what I recognize as words, but not words in English. She points out plants, telling me what they do, how they grow, how they're helpers, naming them and singing her songs and doing more naming. Both types of songs in the hills and in dance class provide comfort. Both anchor my childhood in a rare, peaceful way. I know now this place, this dance class studio, to be a regular place, to be perhaps even somewhat shabby in its construction. I know now it's not a fancy place, most likely by anyone's standards. But this fall, I feel so fancy in my leotard and tights, and this place feels so fancy. I imagine the cost of these lessons is made possible by the extra hours my mother works, or through a grandparent's generosity, or both. Part of why it feels fancy is because I know, even this young, my presence here to be precarious, anomalous, rare. I know already we don't have money for a good many things, so I know this is special. Toward the end of each dance class, teacher Marianne turns us loose to chasser in circles around the room. According to Webster's, in French, chasser simply means to chase. And that's what our feet do, back feet chasing front feet, as we bend our knees and point our feet, moving at something close to a leap run. We're together, our hair and cheeks flapping. We laugh and smile wide and breathe hard. After class, I'm the only one to move by myself down the back steps of the 2-story building and up the side steps of the building next door. My father, the first day, had shown me how. We practiced. By this day, I've almost mastered plie and chassé. I've well mastered the art of down one staircase and up another. I've mastered the art of keeping secret from my mother that my father doesn't pick me up, that I go over to pick up him. I hold the secret close because I love both dance class and the bar. I love the songs without words, mirrors at the front, my soft shoes scuffing on the wide expanse of linoleum. The bar holds low ceiling tiles, dim fluorescent lighting, and metal stools where I sit and am allowed to kick my feet against their rungs. My father drinks beer, and I drink orange soda and snack on barbecue potato chips. Country music plays on the jukebox or radio, usually old school country, what my father calls real country music. The other country music that sounds like pop or top 40 is called horseshit or horseshit country. Today, it's old school country, and I know my father hasn't been drinking too much because he only sings along for one stanza to see if I will too. So I do, though it's not my favorite thing to sing in front of people. I can sing. I know this already to be true, and it's a thing I love privately, but not publicly, except for church and the bar with my father.
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Toni. That's great. I love the horseshit country music. Yeah, that's good. Well, I think we've come to the end of the hour. Don't know if, here we go. Yeah.
All right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brandon. Thanks for joining us again. And there's a link in the chat tonight to pre-order Brandon's book, The Removed. Toni, congratulations on this excellent book. We couldn't be happier for you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight and doing this event with us. And I know that a lot of the people that are watching tonight already ordered a copy of the book, and it has been shipped out to them. But if you don't yet have a copy of Carrie, this is definitely a book that you want to have and start reading immediately. So thank you very much. Best of luck as this book continues to grow and grow. Thank you very much, Toni.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thanks for
Thanks,
coming.
everyone. Thanks,
Good night,
Toni.
everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Brandon, bye.
Okay. Bye. Good night.